Hey there, I'm here at home with my chickens right now, but I recently went up to northern Wisconsin. The difference over there is it's a lot colder over there. Over here in Illinois, it's late spring, it's up to about 60 degrees right now. But in Wisconsin, it was still in the 40s. So since it's a much colder place up there, you can see maybe not as many insects or reptiles, stuff like that coming out this time of year. But they do have a lot of lichens. So I have a video to showcase, a basic overview of some examples of some lichens. It's not going to be too in-depth because a lot of the studies that you can do about lichens requires a microscope, which I'm not really going to do, but just a basic overview of lichens. What they are is they're a symbiotic relationship between at least one type of fungus and at least one type of photosynthetic organism, which is usually a type of algae or a cyanobacteria. They're pretty interesting because, like I said, they like colder environments, and they can also survive in very dry environments. The way that they work is they're a fungus, usually a ascomycete fungus. There could be more types of fungus, and then usually an algae. And the algae produces all the food for the fungus. They photosynthesize to produce food. And then the fungus isn't like other fungus that I've shown on this. They don't grow their hyphae into the substrate that they're on. They just use the substrate as, just kind of a place to live and anchor themselves. So they're not parasitic on any type of plants that they grow on. But a cool thing about them, because of that, you could find them growing on more than just wood, more than just organic material. You'll find them growing on sidewalks and statues, rocks, and metal fences and stuff. They're not limited to just growing on organic material. The lichens form a structure that's kind of like a leafy structure or a branch-like structure. So the three main types of structures that lichens grow, which I'll show examples of each of them, is they have a crustose structure, which is, it's what it sounds like. It just makes a crust on its substrate. And then there's a fruticose, which has little branches coming off of it. And then there's foliose, which is like leaves. So that's the structure that they make. And then within that structure, they have a dense layer of hyphae that does not have any algae in it. It serves as a layer of protection for the algae. So that's a symbiotic part of their relationship. The fungus forms a protective layer over the algae to protect it from various environmental factors, while the algae will produce all the food and the energy source for the fungus. And then below that dense layer of hyphae is a looser layer of hyphae that contains algae embedded into it. So that's the basic structure of a lichen. And you can see them, as I'm about to show, there's different colors. Those are the pigments produced by the algae. They're usually going to be green, or sometimes they could be yellow, orange, brown. So the structure of it, the shape of it, comes from the fungus, and the color comes from the algae. Some cool environmental things about algae. But obviously, I said that, they don't parasitize the plants and stuff that they're growing on. They get all their energy from the algae. So the photosynthesis produces sugar for the fungus to use as energy, but they need to get their minerals and stuff like iron, sodium, potassium, all the stuff that we need. They need to get that from the surrounding environment other than the algae. So because of that, they are very good at absorbing those materials, minerals and metals and such from the air and water around them, like rainfall and stuff. So that's where they get that. They're very permeable to those type of metals and stuff through the air and the water. And because of that, they're a pretty good indicator of whether or not an area has a lot of air and water pollution. So if there is a lot of pollution, they're going to be absorbing a lot of those heavy metals from the air, which is, a mechanism that they need in order to get their minerals. But in polluted areas, that's harmful because they'll take in a lot of those toxic metals. So in like urban areas or suburban areas like I am, you're not going to see that much lichen diversity. And the ones that you do see are going to be pretty smaller types of lichens They just form a crust, or like they look like little dots on something. You don't really see as much as the big leafy and branch-like ones that I'm going to show you. So that's another difference between what it's like in here and in Wisconsin. So the reason why they like cold and dry temperatures, they're considered to be very hardy. They've sent lichens up into space and found that they were able to live in outer space. So you could consider them very hardy because they can survive without any water or in very cold temperatures for long amounts of time. They enter into a dormant state where they don't need to use any energy. So one might consider them hardy. However, that's just kind of their little niche that they found. They like cold and dry environments. A lot of those species wouldn't really be able to survive well in the tropics. There are certainly lichens in the tropics, but you know, they have specific adaptations for that area. If you took one from, you know, from up in the mountains, there's even lichens up in Antarctica. If you took one of those and put it in the tropics, they probably wouldn't be able to survive very well. And the reason for that is, obviously, they need water. It's good for them. From my understanding, I think the water will increase the permeability of that outer layer of hyphae to expose the algae, which is a good thing, because they need to let sunlight in for the algae to be able to photosynthesize. However, that also exposes the algae for different harmful things from the environment. So they need some moisture, but it's kind of a delicate balance between being able to produce energy and being protected from the environment. So they can survive in very dry temperatures, and they need some moisture, but too much moisture is not a good thing for them. Dryness is also another good thing for them because, you know, you could imagine, you know, a leaf or something getting dry, it gets very crumbly and little pieces break off of it easily. That's a good thing for the lichen because that's a way for them to to reproduce asexually. The little piece can break off of it and it's able to grow on its own. So that's one way that they reproduce asexually. Otherwise, they can reproduce sexually. Like I said, a lot of them are ascomycete fungi. So, as I'll show you in a little bit, a lot of them produce reproductive structures that look like cups that produce spores. The tricky thing about lichen sexual reproduction, though, is because for most types of sexual reproduction, you have to just have two compatible things joined together to form a new organism. However, since they're in a symbiotic relationship, you need to have two of those spores form together, and then you also need the other symbiote, the photosynthetic component to join. So you need three things to join together: two compatible spores, and then a species of algae or cyanobacteria that's going to be able to live symbiotically with the fungus and produce energy for it. So that makes sexual reproduction pretty difficult. You know, a little bit trickier for lichens, but they find a way. They still do reproduce both sexually and asexually. And a lot of the types of fungus and some of the types of algae are not able to survive independently of each other. You know, the fungi, I guess, as they've been living together with these algae, they've kind of lost their ability to produce energy on their own. So if you try and grow them in a lab without their algae component, they're not really going to be able to grow well. And then the algae gets the benefit from the fungus of being protected from the outside environment. There are some cases where they're able to survive pretty well on their own, so they don't always need the fungus, but a lot of times they can't survive on their own either. So that's why you have a lichen is its own separate category that's not defined, you know, individually by each species of the fungus. They usually will name them after the two things coming together, and that's what defines a lichen because they can't really survive on their own. So that's the boring part, is me talking, and now I'll show you some examples of different types of lichens that I found. In this area, you can see it's a rural area, and it's also in, you know, a much colder environment than what I'm used to. So you see some really good diversity of lichens, and a lot of types of lichens that I don't really see around here in the suburbs. I don't know if I went to rural Illinois, I would be able to find the same ones, but I found a really nice environment of lichens living together with some good diversity. And then at the end, I'll show some videos of some other stuff I did. I made a video from the top of a waterfall that you get to see. And I also went swimming in Lake Superior in 40-degree weather, so I'll put that clip in there as well. Here are some examples of some lichens on this stick. I may not be accurate in my identification of them because, like I said, a lot of times you need to use microscopy, which I'm not using. But over here you have this leafy lichen, which is an example of the folio structure I was talking about. This is likely what they call a shield lichen, which belongs to the genus Parmelia. You can notice that some parts of it look more green than others, whereas some look more pale. The greener parts are more moist. Like I said, the hyphae kind of move out of the way to expose the algae so you can see their green color, and as it dries up, the algae are more protected, so it looks more pale. If you'll turn your attention over to that little branch leafy looking thing on the left side, I wish that I had gotten better footage of it, but this is an example of the fruticose lichen that I was talking about that has more of a branch-like structure. And I believe that this is a member of the species Ramulina fastigiata. You can see it sticking out on the top right side of the stick in this scene. Like I said, I wish I got better footage, but it's got kind of a green seaweed-like structure, and you can see the cups growing on the end of it. It's a sexual fruiting body. Over here, I'm zooming in on, you can see the shield lichen. It looks smaller, but you can see the fruiting bodies of them. It's an ascomycete fungus, so it makes cups to produce spores. So you can see they got the pale green on the outside and dark brown on the inside. It's a fertile surface that produces spores. You can see other little things growing in there as well that I don't know exactly how to identify, but you can see the diversity that's on this stick right here. Over here is a new type of lichen called a sunburst lichen, and you can see the fruiting body. It's also a foliose type with leafy structure. This one does not have any fruiting bodies, but the other one you can see it did have the cup-like fruiting bodies. Once again, ascomycete fungus. So this one you can see the foliose structure that looks like leaves. Also right next to another of the shield fungus of Parmelia. And then over here, I don't know exactly what kind of a lichen this is, but you can see the different colors. The black and brown species tend to be a combination of a fungus and a cyanobacteria, whereas the other green and yellow-orange ones that were previously mentioned are usually a fungus and an algae. And all the previous footage, the previous lichens I described, are all on the same branch, the same stick, so you can see there's some good diversity just on one branch from the tree. Over here is a lichen that belongs to the genus Cladonia. And lichens in this genus are often called reindeer lichens because a lot of them, not this one particularly, but a lot of them can grow very big and they make a good food source for reindeer. You can see this one has not as many fruiting bodies, so you can mostly see the structure of the actual lichen, which is called a thallus. Without the fruiting body, it's called a thallus. But a key feature of Cladonia has these little stalks that grow up for their fruiting bodies, and they have cups on the end, as you can see here. I think this one is called the powder horn cup, but I'm not exactly sure what particular species. And then if you look deeper down at the thallus, this one's pretty closely associated with moss, but if you try and look past that, it appears to be a folio structure because it looks like leaves, but this is actually a different type of structure that hasn't been discussed yet, called a squamulose structure. That it looks leafy, but the way that the scientists describe it is actually like overlapping scales. And the way that you can tell the difference is because if you turn over the bottom edge, there's not going to be a difference in color between the top and the bottom. So that's just a little subtle difference between a foliose and a squamulose structure. Over here is the top of a fence post, which has a couple different Cladonia species. The one that catches the eye the most is the one that has little red caps on it. I couldn't tell you exactly what species they are, but some common names that might describe some fruiting bodies that have red caps on them are the British soldier lichen, because I guess at some point British soldiers would wear red helmets. And then another fun name is the Madame's pixie cup.
which is basically another word for, if you've ever heard of a diva cup, that's another word for it. So I think that's kind of funny. And then amongst them are also some other Cladonia species that do not have the red cap on them, and they have kind of a brownish or pale green color. So there's a couple different types of Cladonia species over here on this fence post. And over here we have our final example of a crustose lichen. I don't know exactly what species it is, but just to show the type of morphology of a crustose lichen that is more closely associated with the bark and, more embedded in it and not really rising up from the surface like the foliose and fruticose examples. And here's one with some nice fruiting bodies on it, the cup structures. This is more similar to something that you might see here in the suburbs, as opposed to ones with the larger fruiting bodies like the fruticose and the foliose examples that I showed.